Okay, so I know Pastor Michelle and y'all talked a little bit about 1 Samuel, and that these books were at one time originally one, they're separate in our English Bibles, but they were one full book originally with some different contributors to the story. And the difference that you're going to find, we'll talk a little bit more again when we get together to the Chronicles of the Kings. Those stories you're not going to find Bathsheba in the Chronicles. You're not going to find David's sending out the order for Uriah to go in the front lines and then for the troops to pull back. You're not going to find the Civil War really in any kind of detail with with Absalom and the rape of David's daughter. Those kind of things that are on the shadow side, they're all kind of sanitized in the Chronicles because the chronicler is employed by the king. He's part of the royal court. So he's putting the king in the best light and leaving out the parts, whereas the Samuel prophet is going to look at it from a faith lens of the things that makes David a great king and the places where he falls short and his faith in the midst of all those things. And I think if any of us think of our own lives, we have things that times and moments when we are close to God or where the gifts of the Spirit are very evident and we have a heart for God, and then there are moments when we fall short or sin takes us away and we lose our way and kind of become, and sometimes hard to recognize in ourselves the things that we've done, or we lie to ourselves. And David's going to have some of those moments as well where you see that famous confrontation, come on in, with the prophet Nathan, where he kind of holds a mirror up to David and says, he tells that parable of a man and his sheep, his lamb, with the parallel to Uriah and Bathsheba, his wife, and says, "You're the guy." After David gets all upset and says, "That man should be killed." Well, it's you. I'm telling you the truth, and truth is sometimes hard to hear, even if it's from somebody you trust, because sometimes we're avoiding the truth or we're burying the truth so that we keep doing the things that are wrong. And God's saying, whoa, you've got to see this and deal with this if you're going to walk with me and be a leader of my people. So, as we jump in, what are the things that stood out to you about, let's talk about the positives of David, the things that made him a good leader. So what were some things that, as you read from both 1 Samuel and then today, as we've read through 2 Samuel, some things that you thought, these are some strong character traits of that would make a good king, a good leader for Israel. Some things that you saw that jumped out to you. Yeah, Angel.
He was faithful and obedient to God.
Yeah, he seeks God almost always. Not 100% of the time. Nobody probably is that good, but he does his best. You can say he does his best because in his strengths and in his failures and before battles and all these times, he is first seeking God often, almost always. Yeah. Any other characteristics that you see about David that you think?
Fair, generous.
All right, and what were some things that made you, that bring those qualities out? Some stories or that you thought were fair or generous?
I just spent 9.5 hours in the car.
All right, so I agree with you. Anybody else want to help her out?
When he was dividing things up, he gave them to all the different people, not just the people that he was working with, or just Judah or whatever he shared with.
Okay, he treated the tribes equally, sought to hear the different tribes equally, yeah?
He kept his word to Saul.
Yeah. So there's two things, right? David, in 1 Samuel, Saul gives him all kinds of reasons to abandon him, to kill him. There's several times when he has Saul in a moment in the crosshairs where he could take his life, in the cave and at the well, but he doesn't, because he says, I believe God has appointed you, and I'm here to serve you, even though Saul is paranoid about him, he's insecure about him, he probably has some mental health I mean, he could distribute. He shows signs of like almost like a bipolar personality. At one moment he's really nice to David, and David's his best friend. Next minute he's throwing spears, trying to nail him to the wall and kill him. Yeah, so Saul. He treats Saul with fairness and generosity in his life and loyalty, and then he carries that over to his son Mephibosheth and his other sons after he's dead, and cares for them like they're his own children. So yeah, there's a lot of generosity and loyalty, and you see that also with his friend Jonathan and his loyalty to Jonathan. So David's a very loyal person for the most part. He does get into trouble on the rooftop, but we'll get to that later. But we're talking about pros right now. So generosity, loyalty, fairness, open heart to God, a heart like, you'll hear that phrase, David's got a heart like God's own heart, seeks God. He's a musician. Many of the Psalms are attributed to David. He plays, for King Saul, we see. Anything else that you see?
Well, he's able to acknowledge when he gets something wrong.
Yes. He has a humility. And despite how popular he is, and he is popular, he is not too proud to say, this is my fault, and ask God's forgiveness, and ask the people's forgiveness. So yeah, he's not, his ego isn't so big. There are moments when we seem like David might be a little tempted by corruption of power, but not, like any king might be. But he fights that. He fights that in ways that some of the other successive kings do not. We'll see that not too far down the road from David.
Maybe another example of good leadership, loyalty, whatever you want to call it, but I picked one example, I don't know if it happened more, but when he sent his troops, his men out to battle, he wanted to lead them, and at least once, one of the guys said, no, you cannot go, we do not want you hurt, we're just...
Yeah, especially towards the end of his life, right? David goes out for one more campaign, and he stumbles and nearly is struck down, and Joab says, go home. You're more important alive to us as a figurehead. He doesn't use this term, but more as a leader of Israel. You're more important from the safety of protection than out here amongst the troops. But yeah, he leads by example, right? And he's brave. He's brave. Whether it was shepherding his father's flock and he's fighting bears and lions, or he's taking on Goliath, and nobody else wants to take on that challenge, or he's running from his king and being hunted down, he's still, loyal, and at the same time trying to remain true to his office as Saul's general. So yeah. All right, so let's flip the coin a little bit. What are some of David's weaknesses that you've seen that the scripture talk about here?
Seems like women, because he said he had many wives.
Yeah, he takes several wives, and he has some difficult relationships with them. But particularly the story that is the crucible of that is Bathsheba. And we'll get into that first after we get through some other weaknesses. But yeah, he definitely has some problems with his wandering eye. He gets lustful. And we're going to see that some of that seems to have some carryover with some of his family members. Because Solomon's biggest problem, who becomes king after David, is that he has many wives, 700 wives, and 300 concubines. That's a lot of women. I don't know how you would... I mean, that's Wilt Chamberlain kind of thing, right? But the problem is that the warnings of the Torah were that if you get distracted by particularly wives of other foreign gods and peoples, they'll bring their faith practices, they'll divide your loyalties as king to Israel and Israel's God, and you'll lose your way, was what happens with Solomon. And we'll get to that in the next book. But so David, maybe by his example with some of his shadow side with women and relationships there, his sons see some of that and maybe don't fall far from the tree. Anything else that you see from David? Parenting. Thank you. So it's really interesting. As king, David does not back down from a challenge. He meets confrontation head on. If it's an enemy on the battlefield, he goes to Saul directly. He says, I mean you no harm. I had you in the power of my hand. Why are you trying to hurt me? In negotiating fair treaties, with King Hiram of Tyre, he's very direct with the rape of his daughter Tamar in chapter 13, with his then failing to deal with his son, the crown prince Amnon, who rapes his daughter, and his half-brother Adonijah, who is Tamar's brother. Adonijah, Absalom. There's a lot of A's. Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah. So Absalom with his curly locks. He kills his brother as retribution because David doesn't speak about the rape of Tamar, even though she's in court with her beautiful garments as a princess rent and crying out. And it's not, she's being very public about it because she wants David to do something. He doesn't. Sends her back to live broken. Her brother plots and schemes and wants payback. Doesn't see David doing anything about it, so he takes it into his own hands and kills his brother, the crown prince, and then runs away. And David doesn't deal with that either. He just leaves him in exile for several years, and then it takes his general to prompt him to bring him home. Then when he brings him home, he says, okay, bring him home. He still says, don't bring him into my presence. I don't want to talk to him. So he still doesn't deal with it. And a couple more years pass, and Absalom again forces issue, but by this time, there's so much of a wedge between them that Absalom now tries to take the kingdom from David. So he's very passive as a parent, and he's a great king. He's not a great dad in terms of dealing with family stuff in his family. And we'll see that with each of his sons are going to struggle and have. David's lack of clarity with his kids leads to a lot of violence and a lot of problems with who's supposed to be succeeding David, and we'll see that that's a mess too. So there's a lot of issues with his family life. Great public figure, but let me ask this. Somebody who's really involved in their work or really involved in their role as a public figure, does that mean they're always good at their private life? No. So it's actually, I think, a pretty big gift that we have the book of 2 Samuel that shows us the fuller picture, or the more honest picture of David. We see his strengths, but we also see kind of his warts and spiritual blemishes too. And that's a powerful thing, I think, in this text. So let's get to Bathsheba, and I'd actually like us to turn to, before we do, we'll work our way back, but since you brought, and it's probably one of the most famous stories of this book. So you read in chapter 11, and it's very powerful in the Hebrew, because it starts off right off the bat. In the spring, in the time of year when kings go out to war, David stays behind. And right away we know this is not typical of David. Normally David's leading his army. But in this instance, I'm not feeling too well, I'm going to stay home. And he lets the army go out without him, first time. And then he's on the rooftop. And so I want to say a few things about this text. A lot of times I've heard it preached that, Bathsheba's kind of tempting David. She's on, why is she taking a bath on the rooftop in sight of the king? Well, the king's powerful. His palace is higher than everybody else's. He's got the prime real estate. So he is spying on her. And I also want you to think about this. Bathsheba never speaks until she misses her period. So any portrayal of Bathsheba as, seducing David or being loose or anything like that, David's the king. David sees this girl. He sends for her as the king, and she comes to his summons. It's also important to note David asks who she is, and they tell him she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, if you read through the whole book of Samuel and you read 2 Samuel, you read carefully, the 30 mighty men of David, the guys who protected him while he's running from Saul, the guys who fought for him since day one, and who's the last one listed? Uriah the Hittite. So this guy is somebody who's been loyal to David, who's known David for years, who's camped out with him in caves to hide from Saul, who's defended him with his life. And so David knows what he's doing is wrong. And he sends for her anyway. Then he sends her home, right? After he has sex with her, he sends her home. And then you hear Bathsheba's voice. My lord the king, I'm pregnant. What's David's action after that? Does he tell the truth? Does he confess? Does he tell Uriah, I've committed adultery with your wife, I'm sorry, let me atone for this? No. He sends for Uriah, trying to get Uriah to go home to his wife so that Uriah won't know that the child that she's pregnant with is his. And then you hear, Uriah, how can I do this, my lord? My brothers are fighting in the field of battle. I can't come home and sleep in, my bed with my wife and enjoy the comforts of home while I know these guys are fighting for you. I shouldn't be here. David then tries to get him drunk so that he'll go home. And, when that fails, this is just a brutal story. When that fails, he, in his own hand and his own seal, signs the order, Joab, send him front a suicide mission, attack the walls, pull back, and send him to die. And he gives it to his friend to deliver it to his general. This is the dark place of David, right? He sees something, power corrupting. He sees something, he takes it, and he's maybe he's forgotten the consequences of his actions. He's the king. I can do this. I can do whatever I want. I'm the king. Well, no, you can't. And then we have this confrontation with Nathan the prophet where he tells a story of a guy with his lamb, and he's taking the lamb to bed with him, and so he's really over the top. This guy loves his lamb a lot.
Takes her to bed with him.
But yeah, so the point is, David's getting upset and angry, and he tells the story of a man with his lamb, and you might think that's crazy, but what is David before he's a king? He's a shepherd boy. How could somebody, do this? I know this life. How could somebody do that to somebody who's poor? And I know people like that. And so David's all upset, and Nathan says, that's you. I know what you've done to your friend Uriah the Hittite. You had him killed. You slept with his wife. And now you've had a child with her, and you've tried to cover it up. And to your point, David shows remorse. He fasts. He prays to God to spare the life of the child. It's very painful but beautiful scene. His men are worried he's going to do himself harm. And when the baby dies, David washes himself. He goes and eats. They're confused, and he says, well, I will go to where he is. I'll die. But I can't bring him back. What God has and this is my fault. He blames himself because of the sin he started and the mayhem it's caused. And I say this is really an important story, not just for David, but right the very next chapter, we have Amnon, who's going to be the next king. And what does Amnon do? He sees a girl who is his half-sister. He says, I want her. And he does the same thing his dad does. And he has her. And she tells him, don't do this. Talk to your dad. The king will let us be married. You could, as a king, Abraham has his half-sister, Sarah. But Amnon does not. And so we have this very painful, dark story of a rape in Scripture. And a lot of times when I talk to like collegiate kids, or it's never okay to do something like this to somebody without the coercive sex, manipulation. But at the same time, that doesn't define who you are. And there's a beautiful part of that story, even though it's really dark, in that Absalom takes his sister into his care, and Absalom gets married and has a daughter, and he names her after Tamar, his sister, saying, you're a beautiful person. I'm going to name my own child after you because of my love for you, even though David lets all this happen. So I have this big shadow side. Any comments or thoughts about that particular story, because it's a well-known one? Or anything that's jumped out to you, any of that?
Can I back up to
Yeah.
David killing
Uriah, yeah.
One of my thoughts was that maybe he was just scared, and the fear just brought him to make this whole story up, and
Yeah.
makes him sound a little not as bad as
Yeah, okay. So less scheming, more just afraid, and his initial sin. I guess think about it this way, and I like what you're saying there, Kathy, and I appreciate you bringing that up. If you've created, all right, you've done one sin. So his first sin is he's lusting after somebody who's not his wife. Hasn't done anything yet, but that's sin number one, right? I objectified this woman. I know she's somebody else's wife. If he hadn't have acted, he still would have sinned, but more minor. Then he calls for her and sleeps with her. All right, this lesser sin becoming greater sin, and more people involved. Now you've involved her too, and now Uriah tangentially. And then now you're bringing Uriah in. And maybe his fear, but what started off as something, stroll on the rooftop, has spiraled out of hand and now grown into a much bigger, much deeper hole. And so, whether that's sin, I think probably all of us as human beings have experienced this. You tell yourself, oh, I just told a white lie. Well, then you lie to cover up the lie, and it becomes bigger, and it becomes more complicated. And, the more you build up one sin to, take that path, the further and further you get away from God and the person that you're trying to be before God, I think is a danger. And sometimes you act less out of faithfulness and more out of fear of repercussions, fear of getting caught. Anybody ever experienced any of those things? Am I the only one here? Are we being honest? Yeah, all right, nobody wants to be on film. I understand. But that's a very human thing. David is, in that way, David's a very poignant example of the trouble sin can get you into and how you can lose your way really fast. And then let me ask you this on the flip side. How many of you have somebody in your life who tells you the truth, even if you don't want to hear it? Like a friend that, even if, if they see you doing something, whether that's an accountability partner, a prayer partner, or somebody in your life that says, hey, you're out of line on this. Do you think Jesus would, if Jesus was sitting in the room with you while you're doing this, or while you're, doing these things, would that make Christ happy? somebody who's kind of, I don't want to say blunt. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be blunt. It could be with a lot of love and gentleness, but it could be they're just blunt and they throw it out there. What's it like having somebody that's that truthful in your life?
It hurts, it's hurtful.
Stings, yeah.
Yeah, there's some pain. Sometimes the truth can be painful. But is it more helpful to have them than not? Do they sometimes shake into reality?
Once you get, I think once you get through that, once
Yeah.
you get through the hurt of it, hearing it, and you can take a deep breath and think about it, and go, okay,
Yeah, there's some truth in there.
The fact that they're
that-
still there at the other end of it too, they're accepting you for whatever it is that they've found.
Yeah, they're not giving up on you,
Yeah.
but they are telling you, hey, out of love, I think you should really wrestle with this, because this isn't who I know you to be. And Nathan does that on several occasions in Scripture, but he is that mirror, spiritual mirror for David at the end of this piece. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were raising a hand there, Angel. Were you raising a hand?
No.
Okay. Then we have Absalom, who, is very charismatic, very good looking. The Bible talks about his hair, how heavy his hair is when he gets a haircut every year. The people love him because he kind of sneaks in. He doesn't, it's really interesting. I called David a passive figure with his family because he doesn't realize, it doesn't seem, that Absalom is now making judgments on the king's behalf. He's kind of put himself in the middle at the gates for every tribe, and he's, brokering deals and gaining the people's trust, and says the people love him, and then all of a sudden, David's kind of asleep at the wheel, and maybe it's because, I could see this very possibly, and this is conjecture, but when you've failed, when you've been broken in your personal life, when you've failed your daughter, when you've committed adultery, when you're coming back from something that's painful, and probably in public, now you might not have the same confidence you did before in leading, because you're wondering what people are thinking of you, or you're second guessing yourself. And so he does nothing, and next thing you know, Absalom's calling himself king, and David and his people are fleeing, and we have then what's going to be a setup for 1 Kings and Solomon. We have David on the run, and we have this division of who's siding with who between Absalom and David. And I gave you some notes there from the reading. So you have Hushai, who is one of David's counselors, who is a foreign-born, and then you have Ahithophel, who is David's kind of main wisdom counselor of the court. And Ahithophel goes with Absalom and is advising Absalom on what to do. And then you have a confusing division of the house of Saul. You have Ziba, who comes and brings David all kinds of supplies and tells him that Mephibosheth, remember crippled, who has fallen, been dropped as a, we joke around, you dropped on your head as a child. Well, Mephibosheth was dropped as a child, and he's lame because of it. And so now Ziba is saying, Mephibosheth sees this as an opportunity to now become king and restore Saul's line, and he's plotting against you. So Mephibosheth seems to be on Absalom's side, and we're going to get another side of that story later, but for now. And then there's Shimei, who is also a former Benjamite, Saulite, who is throwing rocks at David and his fleeing entourage and cussing them out and cursing them to God and making life miserable for them and saying, you deserve this because you are, and again, there's some truth here, you are a man of blood. You've killed a lot of people in your reign. And David has been a warrior, but Shimei is accusing him of being too bloody in his dealings. And so we're going to see that at the, there's a great gathering of Israel. David seems like he's in trouble. And then Joab and the other son of Uriah, one of them gets killed early. And then there's also, Abiathar, and Zadok, who are priests who kind of go to Absalom in his court, but they spy for David. So the priests are still faithful to David and are feeding him information. So battle lines are drawn. There's a big fight, battle, and David's commands are very explicit, 3 times in the text, but really it's more than that, because detail after detail, don't hurt the young man, be gentle with the young man. Alive, not dead or alive, alive, bring him to me alive. And powerful, he gets caught in all that hair, right? It's almost, there's an irony there. Absalom's painted as somebody, he's made a statue to himself, somebody whose ego has gotten bigger than his shoes can fill. He's stuck by his hair, hanging between heaven and earth. It's a powerful, the Hebrew is, between life and death. And the people who find him first go and tell Joab, we've got him. Easy to capture, right? He's stuck, right? So he's gift wrapped in a bow. Just take him back to David. And Joab says, why didn't you kill him? All right, so let me ask you this. Joab is throughout this whole text as David's general, sometimes fired as David's general, and Abner takes power. Joab kills Abner. Amasa takes power as appointed general. Joab kills Amasa. Is Joab a good guy, a bad guy? Is he a mix? How would you describe your experience with the character of Joab, son of Zeruiah, in the text? What are your thoughts on Joab?
He seems devoted to the king, and he wants to help him always, and yet, when it comes to forgiveness, he doesn't know how to forgive. He has I get it. Like somebody who met my brother, I guess I have a hard time too. I'm not saying, but I mean, he doesn't have that same, David has a different ability to do, I'm comparing the two.
Okay, yeah, I think you're on to something there, Janelle. David is a person who will give grace and mercy.
Right.
Whereas Joab doesn't seem to have that bone. He is a person of action. He is loyal to David. He kind of cleans up David's messes, usually in a very bloody way. But throughout, I think you also see that Joab, at any cost, any threat he perceives, even if David says it's not a threat, if Joab thinks it's a threat to David's power, Joab will act to make sure David stays in power. In this case, Joab feels like David can't see the danger because it's his own son. So Joab says, we're not taking any risks here. We're going to kill the threat. And he takes matters into his own hand, even though it's very clear that Joab knows what the king's orders were. So he disobeys the king's orders and gets fired subsequently for the second time for taking innocent blood.
Maybe it's in Joab's best interest personally that David stay in power. Maybe that's one reason he does everything to down the line to keep him in power.
Certainly he's become general, right? He's a very powerful man in Israel because of who David is, yeah. Any other thoughts on him? Okay. Yeah. I would describe him, there are 3 parts ruthless, 1 part open. Because we do see some positives of Joab where Joab acts, we see the ruthless side of him here. We see the ruthless side of him, in peace. giving the congratulations to Abner and then stab him in the stomach with his dagger. Of course, Abner did kill his brother, and so he's got a revenge factor there too. But I say we see an openness side to Joab because when David takes a census, Joab says, don't do this. This is a bad idea, and we'll get to that in a moment. When Absalom is exiled, Joab says, my lord the king, you should bring your son back. You're not even talking to him. You should reconcile your son. You know, so there are some points where Joab also tries to steer David again towards what he thinks might be best for the king. So he's like anybody else. He's not just, you know, I think as human beings we tend to paint leaders or people, you know, just broad brush. They are this, you know. There's different facets of every human being, every leader. And so Joab's one of those. Other thoughts before we move on a little bit. Am I losing you? I've seen people nod off here. All right. All right. So David pardons. After the civil war is over, David laments. He pardons Shimei. He pardons Ziba and Mephibosheth. And he's not sure what the truth is, because Mephibosheth said, no, Ziba is the one who is trying to make a ploy and paint me in a bad picture. I've always been faithful to you, but I'm lame. I couldn't flee. So I stayed. And he says, I'll divide the land between the two of you and everything that I've given you. And Mephibosheth, it seems like Mephibosheth is being honest here because he says, no, just give it all to him. I don't want anything. Just let me stay in the position that I've been in. And then we have, you know, just this kind of shifting after all the dust is settled. We see that there's some more turmoil, you know, things in David's cabinet with Joab and Amasa. And then finally, there is these 2 points that I wanted to make. One we have in 2 Samuel 21. This is just kind of a thing that you might easily miss. But 21:19, it's interesting and kind of confusing because it says, there's another battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, son of I don't know that one, Jerogim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite. And so, you know, we heard about Goliath, Gittite before, and some of the descriptions as this is a person who David kills back before he's king. So is it that there are 2 Goliaths? It's possible, certainly possible. Is it 2 different tellings of a different story? Or, you know, 2 different people telling the story in a different way? In the end, it's neither here nor there. It's just something that's kind of jumps out at the page if you are familiar with the other story. And then you also have part of Psalm 18 included here in the text of 2 Samuel. And it's showing, you know, that this one of the Psalms attributed to David here in the text, which I think lends, you know, I've heard some Bible folks saying, well, David probably didn't write many of the Psalms. Well, you know, we got evidence in one of the books that he wrote one of them. I think he's clearly a musician. A lot of the Psalms are just too firsthand knowledge of the life of David for it to be, you know, it's a songwriter that he's talking to or he's writing it himself. And so, yeah. And then we have the census. So was the census this last chapter, which I think is really kind of important. We're going to tackle 2 things here. Both the census in chapter 24 and the recovery of the Ark of the Covenant in chapter 6. So we have 2 stories that may have been kind of confusing and troubling. Let's start with chapter 6. The Philistines have conquered Israel and taken the Ark when Saul and his sons are killed. They move it from town to town. If you remember, God, topples Dagon in the Philistine temple and burns. This isn't a great example, but you remember Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and the Nazis take the Ark, and they have a Nazi box in it, and God burns away the Nazi symbol, and they don't know what they've got here in the power of God. It's kind of that idea with the Philistines. They don't realize what they're messing with. And so then David takes it upon himself to go bring the ark back. And then we have this thing where, it says in chapter 6, verse 3, they carried the ark of God on a new cart, brought it to the house of Abinadab, which was upon the hill, and Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God. Okay, so far so good, right? Maybe. Ahio went in front of the ark, and David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God, took hold of it, for the oxen shook it, and the anger of the Lord struck and was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he had reached out his hand to the ark, and he died there beside the ark. And David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with his outburst upon Uzzah. And then he goes on just a little bit later in 9, how can the ark of the Lord come into my care? So do you remember reading that and thinking, geez, this poor Uzzah guy, the ox is stumbling.
Just didn't want the ark to
He's
fall
just
down.
trying to. So what's going on here? Okay. First of all, this is more a judgment against David than it is Uzzah, although I know Uzzah's dead. But what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that the Torah is very specific. God was very specific. If you're going to move the ark, it has to be the Levites. They have to have special poles to carry it. And you handle this thing as it's meant to be handled, as a relic, an article of the living God. You don't just do whatever you want. And David hasn't consulted anybody. It appears that David is wanting to use the ark almost as a publicity for his victory. He's dancing, he's leading everybody. And while he's happy, the ark isn't God isn't a tool for your own kingship to be more popular. And so this whole plan that David's doing is misguided and wrong in God's eyes. And so the judgment, I know it's on, I know your sensibilities. Why does this guy have to die to teach David a lesson? But that's basically what the writer of Samuel is saying. David, this is your fault. You've handled the things of God carelessly. And now this man is dead because of it. And David's upset. And then you see later that the Levites do bring the ark. All right, David learns. And then they have another procession, but this time David follows the Torah and the way it should be. Because he's also an example, Israel's watching this, right? How you treat the ark before the people as a leader matters to God. And that's what David is doing there. So, we've got that in the back of our mind's eye, because then we're going to have a similar thing happen here at the end of the book. Everybody knows what a census is. You get taxed, you get counted. But in the Torah, you're not supposed to take a census of the fighting men. Why? Because after Moses took it, God said, all right, we're not going to take any more censuses because I am going to be the leader of the army. You rely on me. You don't have to think about your fighting strength and count your men and worry about how powerful you are, because your power comes from me, God, not from you, David. So when David says, Joab, go out and find me how many soldiers we have, Joab says, we shouldn't do this. And when Joab's your moral compass, that's probably not a good thing in this instance, particularly when it comes to fighting, right? Because Joab likes to fight. David says, go anyway. Now, what's really interesting is that In 2 Samuel, this story is told a very different way than it is in 1 Chronicles 21. It says God's angry with Israel, and the Lord incited, in verse 1, David against them. So God is using David to teach Israel a lesson. And what was God's command to Israel? You don't need a king. I am your leader. You don't have to be like all the other nations. Samuel the prophet, you shouldn't have a king. I'm telling you right now as your prophet, don't take a king. The people say, give us a king anyway. And God says, they're going to ask for a king anyway because they want to do their own thing. They're stubborn. So Samuel says, fine. So maybe that's why God's upset, because they still got to have their king. But anyway, in Chronicles, the author of the royal court has changed it. So if you just flip to Chronicles 21 here with me, a couple books later. First Chronicles, sorry. Yes, First Chronicles. Apologies. Good clarifier.
21, did you say?
And if somebody would be willing to be a volunteer for me and read the very first verse. Anybody feeling spry? First verse only. Yeah, go ahead.
And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel.
Yeah. So the devil, or Satan, in this case, is inciting David. Very different than God inciting David. Or you could say that it is Satan as under God, being sent by God. But to say it's God inciting David versus Satan's, so the chronicler has shifted blame, or shifted the overall perspective, so that it's not David's fault, right? As much as the author of Samuel has described it. Because you'd read that differently, would you not? Yeah. And so it's, again, a story where David has, the law of Torah is very specific about if a census is taken, how it's to be taken, and you're supposed to, the reason why, if you do take a census, like Moses did, every soldier had to give a ransom, an offering to God, money to take care of the tent and the tabernacle and the holy things of God, to say, my life, my soul belongs to you, God. If I die in battle, or if I am called to fight, it is under your protection. You're my source of life. And so I'm going to give a thank offering and an offering, a sacrifice to God. David doesn't do that. David doesn't mention God at all in this, but here in Samuel, the author is saying God's behind this, even if David doesn't realize it. David, then, God comes to David and says, why are you doing this? Which seems kind of counterintuitive, because God's starting it, right? And you get, basically, it's I don't want to call it the game show of the Bible, but you get 3 doors. Pick. You can have, people die by the sword and by battle. People die by a deadly pestilence. Or the third one, is it a famine? No, hold on. But anyway, he's got these three months of foes pursuing you, 3 days of pestilence in your land, 3 years of famine. And David says, give us the pestilence. Now it's really interesting, because the Torah says if you don't give the sacrifices, what's going to happen? There'll be a pestilence. So the author of 2 Samuel is going way back to Moses in the Exodus and saying, here's what happens when you don't take seriously your leadership in terms of being a faith leader, even though you're king, having your faith be a prominent example of who you are. Bad things can happen if you're just acting unilaterally on your own accord. The other interesting part of this is where the plague stops when David does buy and pay the price for the threshing floor of Araunah. You say, well, what does that matter? What the heck does the threshing floor of Araunah matter at all? Well, it's where his son will build the site of the temple of God. So it is important. because at this place of disobedience is going to be the place where God's and David's acknowledgement that the king needs to follow God is where the foundation of the temple will be, which is kind of cool. Pretty cool. All right, folks, I've Samuel to death. Did we enjoy 2 Samuel? Was it a powerful book? So we're going to get into Solomon, and just for kicks, I'll ask you, what do you know about Solomon? Have you read ahead? Has anybody read ahead?
I did.
Okay, don't weigh in too much then. What do you know about Solomon? Anybody?
My Bible school,
Yeah.
was like, King Solomon was very wise.
Wise King Solomon. Yeah. Anything else you know about King Solomon?
Built isn't he the one that built the temple?
Builds the temple. Yes. Is he a good king?
In the
That's
beginning.
what
So, most of the time, at least most of the times, the positives of Solomon are often his exploits, his knowledge, his wealth, his expansion of the kingdom, his building the temple, and Solomon does a lot of great things. But Solomon is also going to break every warning that the prophets gave about a king and what the king's power can lead to. Solomon will break them all. He's going to take foreign wives and follow foreign gods. He's going to subject his own people. You were called out of the land of Egypt as sojourners, and you are never to enslave each other, because you remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and Solomon forces conscripted labor on his own people. 4 times in 1 Kings you'll read that. And then one that says he didn't do that. But there's enough times that you can see, and people kill his taskmaster and stuff. It goes south in a hurry. Solomon has for himself many chariots and horses, and he's going to conscript people to the army. And last but not least, Solomon will forget God because he's going to be tempted by worship of other gods. And his wealth is going to be a problem eventually because he gets lots of money to the point where silver isn't even an issue. You know, people don't even consider silver because there's so much gold plentiful in Israel. Yeah, that's great, Solomon, but Israel's going to be in bad shape when he's done. So look for some of that as you're reading 1 Kings.